The fog over San Francisco Bay did not roll in that morning, it exhaled. It was October 12, 1946, a date that history would carefully scrub from the standard textbooks, leaving only whispered rumors in the naval archives of Mare Island and the classified vaults of the Pentagon. Lieutenant Commander Thomas Vance stood on the windswept deck of the USS Kilpatrick, a heavily modified Fletcher class destroyer. His eyes were fixed on the black, windowless silhouette of the vessel moored beside them, the U-234, a captured Nazi submarine that defied every known law of marine engineering. It was 3 times the size of a standard U-boat, a silent steel leviathan that had surrendered in the closing days of World War II, carrying a cargo so volatile, so deeply impossible, that the Joint Chiefs of... Into a glass-rimmed crater, Vance didn't answer. He couldn't. His mind was trapped in the cadence of a single, repeating Morse code transmission that the Kilpatrick's radio room had intercepted 6 hours prior. A transmission coming from a coordinate in the deep Pacific where no Allied ship, no merchant vessel, and no known island existed. The signal was broadcasting using an obsolete Imperial German Navy cipher from 1918. The message was 3 words long: "We are looking." Act I, the cargo of the ghost ship. To understand the nightmare that unfolded in the autumn of 1946, one must return to the chaotic final weeks of the Third Reich. In April 1945, as Soviet artillery hammered Berlin into rubble, a top-secret mission codenamed Operation Schwarzstorch, Black Stork, was initiated on the orders of Martin Bormann. The U-234 departed from Kristiansand, Norway, ostensibly bound for Tokyo. Its official manifest listed passengers of extreme importance: German rocket scientists, Japanese naval attaches, and 12 cylindrical steel containers painted with a single red band. When the submarine surrendered to the U.S. Navy off the Grand Banks of Newfoundland on May 14, 1945, the American orders of Martin Bormann, the U-234 departed from Kristiansand, Norway, ostensibly bound for Tokyo. Its official manifest listed passengers of extreme importance: German rocket scientists, Japanese naval attaches, and 12 cylindrical steel containers painted with a single red band. When the submarine surrendered to the U.S. Navy off the Grand Banks of Newfoundland on May 14, 1945, the American Dr. Lindstrom called Substance 92B, a stable, ultradense element synthesized in the laboratories of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute under the direction of Werner Heisenberg, utilizing experimental heavy water reactors that history believed had failed. The Germans didn't lose the race for the atomic bomb because they lacked the intelligence, Lindstrom explained as they walked through the narrow, claustrophobic corridors of the U-234, now retrofitted with American monitoring equipment. They lost it because they were chasing something far larger than a mere bomb. They were looking for the anchor points. Anchor points? Vance asked, his hand brushing against the cold, damp steel of the pressure hull. The places where the Earth's magnetic field doesn't just fluctuate, but where it. Claustrophobic corridors of the U-234, now retrofitted with American monitoring equipment. They lost it because they were chasing something far larger than a mere bomb. They were looking for the anchor points. Anchor points? Vance asked, his hand brushing against the cold, damp steel of the pressure hull. The places where the Earth's magnetic field doesn't just fluctuate, but where it. Ruptures, Lindstrom said. He stopped before a massive, lead-shielded hatch in the belly of the sub. 2 Marines stood guard, their hands resting nervously on their Thompson submachine guns. The Japanese called it the Mono Yumi, the Sea of the Devil. The Americans call it the Dragon's Triangle just south of Tokyo. The Germans believed that if they detonated Substance 92B within that specific geographic anomaly, they could create a permanent localized distortion in the space-time continuum. A doorway, Thomas. A way to bypass the logistical limitations of global warfare entirely. Vance laughed, a dry, humorless sound. That's science fiction, Arthur. The war is over. We won, did we? Lindstrom looked at the hatch. Behind it, a low, rhythmic hum resonated through the steel. Floorboards, a sound like a giant mechanical heartbeat. It wasn't the sound of the sub's diesel engines, which had been decommissioned weeks ago. It was the cargo itself. Then why did the signal from the Pacific match the exact quantum signature of this hull? The U-234 isn't just a container ship, Tom. It's a tuning fork. And someone out there just struck the match. Act II, the voyage into the Zero Zone on October 15. Under the cover of a total media blackout, the USS Kilpatrick towed the U-234 out past the Golden Gate Bridge. The official story for the crew was an ordnance disposal operation. The ship's logbook was replaced with a classified ledger, and every sailor was required to sign an oath under the Espionage Act, carrying penalties of execution or life imprisonment at Leavenworth. As they cleared the continental shelf, the Pacific Ocean changed. The standard deep blue hue of the water gave way to an oily, unnatural slate gray. The wind died completely, leaving the sea as flat and reflective as a dark mirror. By the 5th day of the voyage, the ship's navigational equipment began to fail. "The gyro compasses are spinning, Captain," reported Lieutenant Miller, the ship's navigation officer, during a tense meeting in the wardroom. "Not just drifting, spinning at a constant velocity of 12 rotations per minute. The stars aren't matching our sextant readings either. According to the night sky, we're currently sitting somewhere in the middle of the Indian Ocean, but our dead reckoning puts us 500 miles west of Midway." Commander Vance looked at Lindstrom, who was obsessively analyzing a strip of photographic film that had been exposed to the air near the U-234's tow line. The film showed bizarre, web-like fractures of light, like miniature lightning bolts frozen in silver halide. "The spatial metrics are collapsing," Lindstrom murmured, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. "We are entering the periphery of the anomaly," the Germans called it, the Nullbereich, the zero zone. It's an area where the Earth's magnetosphere is inverted by the presence of the substance we're towing. Suddenly, the ship's intercom crackled to life with a burst of static that sounded like a human scream stretched over a radio frequency. Bridge to captain, you need to get up here right now, sir." Vance lunged for the door, Lindstrom following closely behind. When they reached the bridge, the scene outside the thick glass windows was nothing short of apocalyptic. The horizon was gone. The sky and the sea had merged into a singular, uniform void of pale luminescent violet. There were no waves, yet the Kilpatrick was pitching violently, its steel hull groaning under immense invisible pressures. The tow line connected to the U-234 was taut as a piano wire, vibrating with a high-pitched whine that cut through the bridge crew's panicked murmurs. "Look at the water," Miller shouted, pointing over the starboard bow. Beneath the surface of the violet sea, huge glowing geometric structures were visible. They weren't islands or coral reefs. They were sharp, crystalline spires that stretched down into the abyssal depths, pulsing with an internal, rhythmic light that synchronized perfectly with the hum from the submarine behind them. "We've passed the threshold," Lindstrom whispered, his face pale with a mixture of terror and scientific awe. "The cargo has activated itself. It's drawing us in." "Cut the tow line," Vance ordered. "Miller, get an axeman down to the fantail. Cut that cable now." "Sir, the automatic release isn't responding," the bridge talker cried. "The electrical system back there is completely fried." Vance didn't wait. He sprinted out of the bridge, down the iron ladders toward the aft deck, his jacket soaked instantly by a strange, oily mist that smelled of ozone and ancient, stagnant earth. As he reached the fantail, he found Chief Petty Officer Kowalski standing over the massive steel towing winch. Kowalski was holding a heavy fire axe, but he was frozen in place, staring at the cable. The steel wire rope wasn't just pulling the submarine, it was glowing. A brilliant neon blue current was flowing up from the U-234, tracing its way along the cable toward the Kilpatrick. Where the cable touched the ship's iron chocks, the metal was melting, flowing like liquid wax, without producing heat. "Get back, Captain," Kowalski yelled, finally breaking his trance. He raised the axe and brought it down with all his might onto the cable. The moment the steel blade struck the energized wire, an explosion of white light blinded Vance. He was thrown backward against the depth charge racks, his ears ringing with a sound like a tearing canvas sail. When he opened his eyes, the world had gone completely silent. The tow line was still intact, but Chief Kowalski was gone. In his place stood a perfectly formed silhouette of gray ash on the deck plates, and the axe lay beside it, its steel head fused into a smooth metallic teardrop. Act III, the intercepted future. The Kilpatrick was no longer moving forward, it was falling. The sensation was unmistakable, the lightheadedness of a prolonged drop, even though the ship remained level on the strange, violet surface of the sea. Vance struggled to his feet, his vision blurry. He dragged himself back to the bridge, where the crew sat like statues, their faces illuminated by the eerie glow of the radar screen. Radar sweep was no longer showing a standard circular grid. It was drawing a spiral, a perfect Fibonacci sequence that wound tightly toward a single point in the center of the display. "Captain," Lindstrom said, his voice strangely calm, almost catatonic. "Look at the radio." The ship's emergency low-frequency receiver was printing out a message on a continuous roll of paper tape. "The old Germans." "It's not coming from outside, sir," the operator whispered, his eyes wide with horror. "The signal is originating from inside our own ship's armory, but the armory is empty. We locked it down before we left San Francisco." Vance pulled his service .45 from its holster and cycled the slide. "Lindstrom with me. Miller, you have the bridge. If anything changes, if that submarine comes 1 yard closer, you fire the aft 5-inch guns directly into her hull. Do you hear me? Sink her." "Yes, sir," Miller whispered, though his trembling hands could barely hold the binoculars. Vance and Lindstrom descended into the bowels of the ship, their flashlights cutting through a darkness that felt increasingly heavy, almost viscous. The air grew rapidly colder until their breath misted in the beams of their lights. The steel bulkheads were covered in a thin layer of frost, but the crystals weren't forming standard hexagonal shapes. They were growing in perfect, tiny squares and triangles. When they reached the heavy steel door of the armory, Vance paused. From inside, he could hear a sound that made his blood run cold. It was the sound of a typewriter, the steady, mechanical clack-clack of an old Remington operating at an impossible, superhuman speed. He threw the heavy brass latch and kicked the door open. The room was illuminated by a faint, phosphorescent glow emanating from the deck plates. Sitting on an overturned ammunition crate in the center of the small compartment was a typewriter. Specifically, the unit from the ship's administrative office that should have been locked 3 decks above. The keys were moving on their own, dancing with frantic, violent precision. Vance stepped forward, his gun leveled at the empty space behind the machine. "Stop. Identify yourself." The typewriter slammed to a halt. The carriage returned with a loud ping. Then slowly, deliberately, it typed a single line: "We are the consumer of the extra-historical." "What does that mean?" Lindstrom cried, pushing past Vance to look at the paper. "Are you an intelligence? A manifestation of the field?" The machine responded instantly. The vessel U-234 was not permitted to surrender. The balances were set for its sinking in the North Atlantic. By altering its destination to the Pacific Redox, you have introduced a paradoxical coefficient of .0047. The rectification is mandatory. "We didn't know," Lindstrom pleaded, his scientific detachment completely shattering. "We were only studying the material. The uranium variant, the substance 92B, what is it really?" The typewriter keys flew so fast they became a blur, the metal arms striking the paper with a deafening roar like a machine gun. "It is not elemental, it is a geometric fraction of the world's ending. The Germans did not synthesize it, they excavated it from the base of the permafrost AT Spitsbergen. It is the weight that keeps the timeline flat. You have carried it to the spatial seam." Vance didn't care about timelines or physics. He saw his crew dying, his ship lost in a lavender purgatory. He stepped forward and slammed the butt of his pistol down. Deep, agonizing shriek that signaled the structural failure of the ship's keel. Act IV, the gathering of the lost. They scrambled back to the main deck. But when they emerged from the superstructure, they realized they were no longer in the open sea. The Kilpatrick and the U-234 had drifted into a massive, circular graveyard of ships, as far as the eye could see through the shimmering violet haze. Hundreds of vessels were floating in a silent, concentric ring, but they weren't just American or German ships. Vance's jaw dropped as his eyes scanned the ghostly fleet. Directly to their port side lay a massive, multi-decked wooden galleon, its sails hanging in shredded, ancient tatters, its hull bearing the carved golden crest of the Spanish Empire. Beyond it sat a British ironclad from the 19th century, its smokestacks cold and rusted, alongside a modern Japanese aircraft carrier that bore the char marks of the Battle of Midway, but its decks were completely devoid of life. There were ships from every era of human maritime history, all preserved in this timeless, windless vacuum. They were all connected by a web of the same glowing, neon blue energy lines that bound the Kilpatrick to the German submarine. "The Bermuda Triangle, the Dragon's Triangle," Lindstrom whispered, his eyes wandering over the impossible armada. "They aren't places where things sink, Tom. They're drainage basins, the places where history lakes when it gets too heavy." "Look at the center," Vance said, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper. In the absolute middle of the concentric circle of dead ships, the violet sea didn't drop into a whirlpool, it rose. A massive column of water, 3 miles wide, was ascending toward the sky like a reverse waterfall, disappearing into a brilliant Blinding ring of white light that spun with the same 12 rotations per minute velocity as the ship's broken compasses. The U-234 was leading the charge. The submarine's bow had lifted out of the water, drawn toward the ascending column by an irresistible gravitational pull. The Kilpatrick, still tied to its tow line, was being dragged along behind it, its screws spinning uselessly in the oily water as it was pulled toward the vertical ocean. "We have to abandon ship," Vance said, turning to the remaining crew members who had gathered on the deck. "Get the life rafts over the side, every man for himself." "To go where, Captain?" Lieutenant Miller asked, pointing at the Spanish galleon nearby. On its wooden decks, figures were visible. They weren't skeletons. They were men dressed in the velvet and iron of the 16th century, standing perfectly still, staring at the Kilpatrick with hollow, unblinking eyes. They weren't dead, but they weren't alive either. They were preserved, like insects in amber, caught in a permanent state of historical stasis. "If we stay on this ship, we become like them," Vance said, his teeth chattering from the intense, unnatural cold. "We jump, maybe the water outside the field is real." "It's not," Lindstrom said. He had climbed onto the depth charge rack, looking out toward the rising column of water. His glasses were gone, his eyes reflecting the blinding white light of the central ring. "The substance. It's beautiful, Tom. It's the mathematics of God. It's the correction code." "Arthur, get down from there," Vance shouted, lunging for the physicist, but it was too late. The U-234 reached the edge of the vertical waterfall. With a sound like a thunderclap, the German submarine was sucked into the ascending column of water, its black hull instantly turning translucent, revealing the 12 red-banded cylinders inside glowing with the intensity of small stars. The energy surge traveled back along the tow line like a lightning bolt. The Kilpatrick's bow lifted violently into the air. Vance was thrown off his feet, sliding across the wet deck plates toward the churning. Was sucked into the ascending column of water, its black hull instantly turning translucent, revealing the 12 red-banded cylinders inside glowing with the intensity of small stars. The energy surge traveled back along the tow line like a lightning bolt. The Kilpatrick's bow lifted violently into the air. Vance was thrown off his feet, sliding across the wet deck plates toward the churning violet sea. He reached out, his fingers catching the lip of a steel scupper hole, his body dangling over the abyss. He looked up one last time. He saw Dr. Lindstrom standing at the apex of the ship's superstructure, his arms outstretched, smiling as his body began to dissolve into the same gray ash that had taken Chief Kowalski. He saw Lieutenant Miller and the bridge crew frozen behind the glass, their faces turning into pale, motionless marble. The Kilpatrick was entering the vertical column. The world turned upside down. The sea was above him, the sky was below him, and the white light in the center was opening like the eye of a colossal, cosmic entity. Vance's grip slipped. He didn't fall into the water. He fell into the lights. Act V, the secret ledger of Mare Island on November 4, 1946, a standard U.S. Navy patrol bomber, a PBM Mariner, was flying a routine search grid 600 miles west of San Francisco when the pilot spotted something unusual in the water below. It was a single-life raft, yellow rubber faded by the sun, drifting aimlessly in the Pacific swells. Inside the raft lay Lieutenant Commander Thomas Vance. His uniform was in tatters, his skin blistered by sun and salt, his hair turned completely snow-white. In his tightly locked arms he held a single object, the logbook of the USS Kilpatrick. He was taken to the Naval Hospital at Mare Island under maximum security. For 3 weeks, he refused to speak to medical staff or military intelligence officers. He only stared at the ceiling. His uniform was in tatters, his skin blistered by sun and salt, his hair turned completely snow-white. In his tightly locked arms he held a single object, the logbook of the USS Kilpatrick. He was taken to the Naval Hospital at Mare Island under maximum security. For 3 weeks, he refused to speak to medical staff or military intelligence officers. He only stared at the ceiling, his fingers tracing invisible geometric shapes on his bedsheets. Finally, on the night of November 27, General Leslie Groves, the military head of the Manhattan Project, entered Vance's isolation ward alone. "We found the ship, Thomas," Groves said, sitting in a chair beside the bed. Or rather, what was left of it. The Kilpatrick was discovered drifting 70 miles off the coast of Oregon. There wasn't a soul on board. The navigation room was covered in a layer of square frost crystals, and the ship's keel was warped in a way that our structural engineers say is mathematically impossible. "It looks like it was stretched like taffy." Vance didn't move his head. And the submarine, the U-234, is gone. No trace of it on radar, sonar, or aerial reconnaissance, Groves said, leaning forward. His voice dropping to a whisper, but something else happened. The day your ship vanished from our radar grids, October 22, our seismic monitoring stations in New Mexico recorded a massive localized gravitational spike. For 12 minutes, everything in the Los Alamos laboratory weighed 4% less than it should have. Groves placed a folder on Vance's bedside table. Inside were the recovered pages of the Kilpatrick's logbook, the pages Vance had carried in the life raft. The ink had been analyzed by naval chemists. It wasn't standard Navy issue. It was a synthetic, iron-based compound that hadn't been manufactured since the collapse of the German chemical cartel, IG Farben. The last entry in the logbook, written in Vance's own handwriting but signed with a signature he didn't recognize, read, "The ledger is balanced. The cargo has reached its destination. Do not look for us in the Atlantic or the Pacific. We are currently navigating the year 1812 and the sky is beautiful." "What happened out there, Tom?" Groves asked, his hand resting on the classified file. "Who wrote this?" Vance finally turned his head to look at the general. His eyes, once a deep blue, were now pale, translucent violet, the exact color of the sea at the edge of the world. "Nobody wrote it, General," Vance said, his voice devoid of emotion. "It was just the typewriter. It's still typing out there in the dark, and it's running out of paper." The case of the USS Kilpatrick was officially closed on January 15, 1947. The ship was towed to the deep waters off the Farallon Islands, packed with conventional explosives, and sunk to the bottom of the sea. The crew was listed as lost at sea during an experimental munitions accident, and their families were given standard government pensions with strict non-disclosure riders. The 12 red-banded cylinders of the U-234 were never recovered, but every year on October 22, the radio rooms of naval stations across the Pacific coast with conventional explosives and sunk to the bottom of the sea. The crew was listed as lost at sea during an experimental munitions accident, and their families were given standard government pensions with strict non-disclosure riders. The 12 red-banded cylinders of the U-234 were never recovered, but every year on October 22, the radio rooms of naval stations across the Pacific coast still pick up a faint, low-frequency transmission coming from an uncharted coordinate in the deep sea. Act VI, the Cronos fracture when General Leslie Groves stepped out of Vance's isolation ward into the freezing mist of Mare Island that December night. He wasn't alone. 2 military intelligence officers flanked him, carrying a steel-bound briefcase stamped with the insignia of the Manhattan. "Project, keep a 24-hour watch on Vance," Groves ordered, his voice dropping to a low hiss. "The change in his eyes isn't a medical anomaly. He brought the physics of that zero zone back inside his skull. He's reacting to things before they happen." Inside the ward, Lieutenant Commander Thomas Vance could no longer find peace in sleep. Every time his eyelids closed, his mind was. "Project, keep a 24-hour watch on Vance," Groves ordered, his voice dropping to a low hiss. "The change in his eyes isn't a medical anomaly. He brought the physics of that zero zone back inside his skull. He's reacting to things before they happen." Inside the ward, Lieutenant Commander Thomas Vance could no longer find peace in sleep. Every time his eyelids closed, his mind was flooded with a cacophony of overlapping timelines. He didn't just see the hospital room. He saw the USS Kilpatrick sailing into the smoke of the War of 1812, and simultaneously, terrifyingly, he caught fractured glimpses of a distant, hypertechnological future, a world of digital screens, vast communication webs, and global monitoring systems trying to decode the very mystery he had just survived. At exactly 200 hours on January 3, 1947, the heavy oak door to his room swung open without a sound. Vance expected a guard or a nurse holding a sedative. Instead, a figure stepped out of the shadows. The man's silhouette shifted and vibrated like a television screen losing its signal, casting a faint, pale violet luminescence against the white walls. He wore a turned-up civilian coat over stained laboratory smock. It was Dr. Arthur Lindstrom. "You're dead," Vance whispered, his hand gripping the iron bedframe. "I watched you dissolve in the vertical sea. Death is a three-dimensional construct, Tom," Lindstrom said, his voice sounding as if it were being played through an ancient, echoing megaphone. "I didn't die, I was integrated. I am here to tell you that the Joint Chiefs are about to make a catastrophic error. They have ordered the Kilpatrick to be wired with thermite and scuttled off the Farallons tomorrow morning. They want to bury the evidence, Vance said, his feverish mind piecing the data together. They want to bury a live wire, Lindstrom countered, his translucent hand gesturing toward the window. The ship's keel was magnetized by substance 92B. If they detonate conventional explosives on that hull, it won't sink the ship. It will collapse the localized space-time matrix of the entire Pacific coast. San Francisco will become a geographic nonentity. You have to go back to the ship, Thomas. The torn pages of the logbook you carried, they are the quantum anchor. Put them back where the anomaly began. Act VII, the final departure. Vance didn't ask how, and he didn't ask why. The unnatural time sense that had infected his brain allowed him to perceive the guards' movements seconds before they made them. He slipped out of the window, dropping into the freezing California mud, moving through the naval base like a ghost through solid walls. By the time he reached the restricted pier, the USS Kilpatrick was already rigged. Heavy cables snake-crawled across her warped, distorted decks. The air around the destroyer was heavy with the smell of ozone, and the water in the slip was flat, oily, and gray. Vance slipped past the perimeter guards, his bare feet silent on the frosted iron ladders of the ship. He ran straight to the administrative compartment, where the typewriter had executed its terrifying message weeks before. The room was freezing. Frost crystals grew in perfect, tiny squares across the bulkheads. On the bolted desk sat the shattered remains of the iron typewriter. Yet from its broken gears, a steady, rhythmic pulse of violet light was still beating. Vance pulled the crumpled, iron-inked pages of the logbook from his pocket, the pages he had guarded with his life in the rubber raft. With trembling hands, he fed the paper into the broken roller of the machine. The moment the paper touched the metal, a deafening hum vibrated through the ship's iron bones. Outside on the pier, sirens began to wail in unison. Spotlights snapped on, cutting through the dense fog, pinning the Kilpatrick in blinding beams of white light. General Groves stood at the barricade, a megaphone raised to his lips. Commander Vance, step away from the vessel, Groves shouted. The thermite charges are on a timed delay. You have 3 minutes. Vance walked out onto the bridge wing, looking down at the army of soldiers below. His eyes were no longer blue. They were a brilliant, terrifyingly deep shade of violet, reflecting the opening of a sky that no one else could yet see. The timer doesn't matter, General, Vance yelled back into the wind. The ship isn't staying in 1947. It never belonged to you. Before the demolition team could reach the boarding ramp, a blinding wave of blue electromagnetic energy exploded outward from the Kilpatrick's hull. Every searchlight on Mare Island shattered simultaneously. The engines of the military transport trucks died, the radio towers sparked and went dark, and then with a sound like a single massive intake of breath, the USS Kilpatrick vanished. There was no explosion, no splash, and no wreckage. The waters of the naval slip instantly flattened, leaving behind only a perfectly formed triangular film of iridescent oil on the surface of the bay. Epilogue: the 2026 declassification for 80 years, the disappearance of the USS Kilpatrick and the captured German submarine U-234 remain the absolute highest classification secret within the United States Department of Defense, filed under the codename Project Cronos. However, in May of 2026, following the death of a retired 94-year-old naval archivist in Bethesda, Maryland, a rusted personal lockbox was discovered by his estate. Inside lay a collection of microfilm documents and a leather-bound diary belonging to General Leslie Groves. The final entry in Groves' private journal, dated October 24, 1976, 30 years after the incident, read, "We spent 3 decades assuming Vance was a casualty of a temporal accident. But yesterday, during a deep-sea survey 70 miles off the coast of Oregon, the crew of our nuclear submarine USS Triton located the remains of an unrecorded shipwreck. It wasn't the Kilpatrick. It was an ancient wooden Spanish galleon from the 16th century, preserved perfectly by the deep-sea currents. Inside the captain's quarters of that wooden ghost ship, our divers recovered a sealed glass bottle. Inside was a piece of standard-issue U.S. Navy stationery, written in the distinct handwriting of Lieutenant Commander Thomas Vance. The letter was dated September 14, 1812. The transcript of Vance's recovered letter was attached to the microfilm. It read, "General Groves, the ledger is balanced. The Kilpatrick has found her permanent station. Do not look for us in the charts of the modern world. We have integrated into the fleet of the lost, and we are currently running parallel to the American naval blockade of 1812. Our 5-inch guns remain silent, for we must not alter the ink of what has already been written, but we are watching. We are the architects of the gaps. Do not look for the cargo, it has become the bedrock of the timeline itself. We are navigating a beautiful sky. To this day, advanced digital radar systems operated by the U.S. Coast Guard near the Farallon Islands occasionally report an unidentifiable radar phantom during the early morning hours of October 22. For less than 3 seconds, the distinct sonar signatures of a Fletcher-class destroyer and a massive, archaic German U-boat appear on the high-tech screens. Moving at an impossible speed of 12 knots, not through the water but 6 feet above the surface of the waves. Before the modern digital tracking,